Thank you all for coming today to today's session, Kill the Bill, Attack Together, Resisting Together. My name's Naveed, pronouns he, him, and I'll be chairing today's session. I'm an activist with LGSM, Global Justice Now, TWT, and I work in human rights. As the title of this session suggests, this incredible panel has been convened to reflect on the coalition that emerged earlier in the year, spearheaded by Sisters Uncut under the banner of Kill the Bill, which sought to resist the expansion of police and state powers proposed within the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill. But of course, this isn't the only bill or law that this government has proposed in support of the carceral state, with the Coronavirus Act greatly overreaching in relation to what the pandemic required, the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Act, or CHIS for Line of Duty fans, granting absolute criminal and civil immunity for state operatives to carry out things like murder, or the kinds of things revealed under the Spy Cops inquiry. There's obviously also been the the Nationality and Borders Bill, most recently, which is seeking to make routine the kind of abhorrent treatment of migrants that we've seen at Napier Barracks, as well as the relentless schedule of cruel and violent deportations that the UK is currently carrying out. So our superb lineup of speakers will help illuminate the wider agenda behind this assault on our civil liberties, the discriminatory way in which state violence is applied, and reflect on the Kill the Bill campaign so far, as well as what the future holds for successful resistance, both in Parliament and on the streets. Rest assured, there will be an opportunity for questions and comments after we hear from all the panelists. I have no doubt you will, but please obviously keep them respectful and less than a minute. A minute is not as long as people often think it is, so please don't be upset if I cut you off. But anyway, you're not here to hear from me, so without further ado, I'm going to move to our first speaker, Belle Ribeiro-Addy. She's the Labour MP for Streatham and co-chair of the Socialist campaign group of Labour MPs. Belle has been outspoken against all of the bills mentioned earlier, both within and without Parliament, and in particular has been at the forefront of the parliamentary opposition to the police bill. Belle, as well as speaking to the continued need for resistance, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on what opposition can look like when the Tories have an 80-seat majority and the Labour leadership has been equivocal at best on a lot of these issues.
Thank you. Well, thank you firstly for inviting me to speak, and specifically on that point. When I think about what happened in direct response to the Policing Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, when we delayed it out on the streets. That's what happened. We didn't. It wasn't something that we could do in Parliament. We don't have the numbers in Parliament, but where we have seen like masses and masses of support out on the streets, we've been able to do certain things. So definitely, I would have all of you continuing to do that. But what I wanted to begin today with talking about was why draconian legislation is needed by the government and why they're railroading it through Parliament. And obviously, this is a completely venal government, which only acts in its self-interest. Essentially, if you are not a Tory, friends or family of Tories or donors of Tories, you can go to hell. That's their general approach. But that alone doesn't explain the authoritarian drive of this government, because that is what it is. It's authoritarian. And in order to defeat it, we need to understand it. So we've had similar governments in the past where there's been widespread corruption, although few have been as blatant as this government. And we can't really say what lies behind the legislation and that it's unprecedented either. So let's look at the Overseas Operations Bill firstly, which effectively grants immunity to armed forces overseas if they commit the most serious crimes, including torture, rape, and murder. Now, we're told that British services personnel don't commit these crimes and have never committed these crimes, so why do we need the legislation? Just this week, it was revealed through a Freedom of Information request that the Ministry of Defence has paid compensation for the unlawful killing of 200 Afghan civilians and a further 86 children. The youngest was 3 years old. And imagine how many more there might be. So this gives us a clue as to why this particular government needs this particular type of legislation. They're giving the same types of immunities to police officers. They're also curbing the right to free speech. Unless you're a hate monger, then your speech is protected. On campuses in particular, they seemed obsessed with that. And they're undermining the right to protest and the right to assembly, as we discussed in the policing sentencing Police and Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill. So if you're poor, black, Asian, or from another ethnic minority, or you're forced to move home frequently, your right to vote is also going to be undermined. So some people say, when it comes to soldiers particularly, that they've always killed civilians and that's just what they do in conflicts, and police officers have broken the law in the past, and governments always try to stop demonstrations and discourage those who might vote against them. So what's new? And we need to be clear, what is new is that all of this in the past was illegal. Whether or not it was challenged, against the fact that all of it was illegal in the past. So now they're trying to make it perfectly legal. Therefore, this has been done carefully and sparingly to make sure that happens. And I think we need to be really, really watchful of that. Now, this government intends to make just as many of these abuses legal as they can, because let's be quite frank, we also mentioned the Nationality and Borders Bill. Now, a lot of immigration lawyers have been able to basically thwart the government and allow people to stay by depending on human rights legislation in particular. So they're trying to do everything they can to circumvent essentially what is good law, and that can only mean that they don't intend to allow us to carry on challenging them. And under these particular pieces of legislation, there can be no doubt or no hesitation and no holding back that the abuses will begin to take place openly, repeatedly, frequently, and if these laws remain unchallenged, we're going to be in for a particularly difficult time. In addition, the government is making itself less accountable, less open to challenge in the domestic courts, as I mentioned earlier. A key motivation for Brexit, for some of the Tory right, was to remove the protection of the European courts, that key European human rights legislation, which has seen us through a lot of difficult cases. And although some of them don't seem to know that the European Court of Justice and the European Convention on Human Rights are not part of the EU at all, but they've launched an attack on both of them as well, and that's key. So if we're going to fight this government's authoritarian drive, we have to understand what motivates it. Isn't simply that they're nasty people, although that's true, and isn't simply that their ideology has always been deeply reactionary, although that is also true. It's politics. It's their politics. 67,000 people died in World War II, and Winston Churchill got harangued when he went to the East End of London. Boris Johnson has presided over more than double that total. Millions are facing higher food and energy prices, as well as tax increases and pay freezes. Hundreds of thousands have been made unemployed. The NHS is being killed off by underinvestment and privatisation. So there's no wonder that the government doesn't want accountability, and there's no wonder that it's whipping up racism, and there's no wonder why it's engaged in a perfectly legal, draconian clampdown. So this government's frightened of the consequences of its own action. It's frightened of popular protest and popular resistance. And so far, it's had an easy ride from the opposition, let's be fair. But as people's anger rises, the free ride might well be over. And no one can, of course, foretell that what's going to happen, but we can be sure that resistance to the government will grow, and the Tories are preparing for it, which explains their agenda. And so the main thing we're calling on all of you to do is to prepare for it too. We have seen various U-turns from this government, as awful as they are over the past years, and that over the past year and a half, particularly during the pandemic. And that's been when we've all stood together, and that's been when the public has made a lot of noise. We've just got to see a lot more of that. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you for that, Belle. And yeah, we're really lucky to have you in Parliament to kind of draw attention to these issues, particularly, as I say, when there's been often abstentions on some of the bills that you've mentioned, or very equivocal opposition. Gracie is here. I don't know if it's a bit much to go to her next, so I'll fill a little bit of time. Can I just check with the audio person if the other mic is available? It is available? Amazing. Wicked. So if you guys could pass that amongst yourself, that would be great. As I say, the next speaker, who will, I imagine, be slightly out of breath as she sits down, is Gracie Mae Bradley. Gracie is the interim director at Liberty Human Rights, which is an organisation that's been doing awareness raising, investigative journalism, and campaigning against the aforementioned bills, as well as very important work raising the alarm on the digital infrastructure that is being built to support the surveillance state. So Gracie, it'd be great to hear obviously a lot about that work, but also if you feel able to take your Liberty hat off, also some of the kind of non-reformist reforms that we should be pursuing to move us beyond resistance to dismantling the carceral state.
Cool. Thanks so much for having me, and I'm really sorry that I'm late. That was a good run from the train station. So, as Naveed says, I'm here from Liberty, and we are one of the oldest and highest profile human rights organisations in the UK, and our mission is really to defend civil liberties and promote human rights. And we were founded in 1934 in response to oppressive policing of the hunger marches. You know, we work, I think of it as a kind of kitchen sink theory of advocacy. We have policy, we have strategic comms, we have an investigative journalism unit, we have lawyers, we have an amazing campaigns team, and crucially, we're a membership organisation. So our members set our policy, are our policy council, are our board, and so on. So please do join us. And I thought that I'd say a little bit about what we've been doing on the Policing, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Bill, also known as the Police Crackdown Bill. I'm sure you've already heard from other speakers about, and know yourselves, what's wrong with the bill. It's a really horrendous bill. It attempts to kind of criminalise us protesting. It is a really significant threat to the nomadic way of life of Gypsy, Roma, traveller people. And it's also really concerning when it comes to what the bill's likely to do to racialise and working class young people. I think that's an element that we don't hear about enough, but the bill includes a kind of prevent style duty, but for knife crime. So that means that there will be a lot more information shared on people without their knowledge, without their consent. And ultimately, it's very likely to make people think, well, I'm not going to speak to my doctor about that, not going to speak to my housing officer about that. If you're already having a difficult time, that's the last thing that should be happening. And of course, it includes more secure schools, aka child prisons, more stop and search. So it's a real full frontal attack on our freedoms and on marginalised communities. And so I suppose when I think about what Liberty's been doing about the bill, obviously we've been working alongside a much wider, amazing movement. You'll all know the Kill the Bill coalition that was really spearheaded by Sisters Uncut. So, you know, we definitely see ourselves as part of a movement, not kind of leading any kind of fight on our own. But the first thing that we did, and it's something that I think is really crucial to Liberty as an organisation, is that we sounded the alarm. We can't work on every civil liberties threat, but what we can do is tell people what's happening so that other people can mobilise how they want to. And if you look back at how the bill was initially press released, all you will see in those press releases are things about measures to stop children being abused, child safety measures, also measures to make the courts more accessible to deaf jurors. Both great things. That was how the government chose to lead the narrative on this bill. And what we spent a lot of time doing was explaining what was actually in it, and crucially, drawing a link between what's in the bill and the awful scenes that we saw at Clapham Common. I was there, that we saw. You know, we were saying, this has already been happening. It was happening before the pandemic. It's happened to BLM protesters, kettled, horse charged. You know, we've seen a nurse fined £10,000 for organising a protest. Now all of this violence at Clapham Common, this is the state of affairs that the bill wants to normalise. So we really had to kind of tear away that veneer of this is all about child safety and deaf jurors and say, no, this is a fundamental attack on our freedoms. With Black Protest Legal Support, we've obviously been supporting people who've been mobilising against the bill, making sure that we all know our rights as we go out and protest. That's something that our amazing advice and information team has been up to. And then, of course, we've been building a parliamentary coalition of opposition. And look, I am very sanguine about the limits of what one can and can't do in Parliament. Like, this is really damage limitation at this stage. But even with an 80-seat majority, if we think about the Overseas Operations Act, that was a law that, the government was essentially trying to decriminalise torture, actually really stinging defeat. Some of it went through, but there was a really stinging defeat on that clause. And so we're hoping that we'll be able to mobilise people in the House of Lords to basically rein in the worst excesses of the bill. But as I say, that's damage limitation. And I think it's really important for us to think about what infrastructure we will need when the bill becomes law, because it's not going to stop people from protesting. That's a fundamental freedom. It's not a gift from the state. What it is going to do is create way more confrontation between police and protesters, because it lowers the threshold at which police can intervene and raises the penalties for doing something the state says you shouldn't do. So there is a lot of that infrastructure in place. It needs way more capacity. We need to think really creatively about that. So we should be planning for what happens as and when the bill becomes law. There also won't magically be more stopping places for Gypsy, Roma and Traveller people. We need to think about how we resource the communities that are at the sharpest end of the provisions in the bill. But crucially, I think we should think about how we got here, because the bill isn't, it's not an isolated incident. It's part of a wider set of threats to our ability to hold power to account, whether that's the government wanting to rip up the Human Rights Act or weaken judicial review, bring in voter ID so that we're not heard at the ballot box. It's part of a much broader picture. And I think my analysis would be that we really need to keep building towards what we want to see in the world, because a lot of the stuff that's coming down at the line at the minute is getting us to say, we don't want that, no more of that. That is the slogan of the Kill the Bill movement, is no more police powers. But we also know that the status quo wasn't working, right? There were things that we were demanding before this bill was put on the table. And I think, if you consider what was happening at the last election, we had some interesting policing policies from the Greens and the Lib Dems. Labour and the Tories were just having a fight about how many more thousands of police officers we were going to have. That's part of how we end up here. So I think it's really important that we build towards what we want and create a sense of political inevitability about the things that we want, so that parliamentarians of whatever party have no choice but to say, well, we're going to do that. And when I think about those non-reformist reforms that Naveed mentioned earlier, we should be militating for a ban on facial recognition. We should be calling for repeal of suspicion of stop and search powers. We should be rolling back taser. We should be rolling back spit hoods. We should be calling for no police in schools. But I think crucially, and what so many people have been calling for, for a long time, but even more loudly, in the last few years, is actually for us to resource those life-affirming institutions that make things like this policing bill obsolete. I think sometimes we get stuck in a bit of a false dichotomy of let's do something or nothing, and the thing is always policing. It's always carceral, it's always coercive. And what we need to do is broaden the scope of the options so that we can agree, yes, we need to do something about such and such social problem, but actually the answer isn't more police, it's not more prisons, it's not more stop and search. And those answers are out there and people have been calling them for a long time. But that, I think, even though this bill is a massive fight and it's not a distraction, it will have a really material impact if it becomes law. But we need our movements to be strong enough that while we defend, we also are building towards those things that we want to see in the world. I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gracie. That was a perfect segue to the life-affirming organisation we're about to hear from with Traveller Pride. And as Gracie mentioned, obviously the way that these laws and bills are applied are always kind of discriminatory. And I think it was recently concluded, right, in the equalities assessment of the police bill that discrimination against GRT and black communities was objectively justified as part of that bill. So to speak on how that discrimination is already experienced by GRT communities and would be made worse by the bill, we've got Lois Jones from Traveller Pride, also a Romani activist and a Kill the Bill activist with Sisters Uncut, the Sisters Uncut coalition of GRT Socialists. So as well as hearing your thoughts, Lois, on the police bill, it'd also be great to hear about the brilliant work of Traveller Pride, particularly as an example of the kind of welcoming, life-affirming, inclusive space we can prefigure despite these troubling times.
Right. I'll start on that. A lot going on there, yeah. So I've actually travelled about 5.5 hours to get here today. And I know, yeah, it's hard on these trains these days. But I think what's most poignant for me about this bill is that it's not surprising for Gypsy and Traveller people. I think that we need to understand that for a lot of people, they're just learning about our cause now. We seem like a new area of activism. But like, we've been doing stuff like this for a very long time amongst our communities. We're also always been known as a very revolutionary and radical people, especially when you look at things like land rights, especially when you look at things like, you know, how in our language, our terms for police and state forces are comparable to that of, like, you know, rodents and snideys. So I think this is something that's been in our language for hundreds of years. And having us as part of wider movements is a necessary step to equality. Well, I don't really want equality, kind of want a revolutionary, radical action, to be honest, if I'm going to be able to order something. And I think something that's quite poignant about Gypsy and Traveller people is how we consume radicalism. Because even on your screens where you see the racist kind of magician's work of My Big Fat Gypsy Weddings, there is radical revolutionary acts within that show, but just because people can't communicate it in a bourgeois middle-class way doesn't make it any less activism. And I think that this is something that we need to do. There needs to be a real big look at classism within politics and how we actually look at the people who built the foundations of change. It didn't come from like Ponzi degrees. It came from working class tables on council estates and homeless shelters. It comes from these places, and it needs to be kind of given back to these people. And we are the people of that change. And I think something that's really important is that we need to understand how scary this bill is when you look at the context of Europe. It is not just here that anti-Gypsyism and anti-Traveller sentiment is thriving. There's been over 250 pogroms against the Gypsy and Roman Traveller community over the past 5 years. Romani women have been forcibly sterilised in the Czech Republic until 2018. There is segregation still in schools and maternity units across Europe. And over this year, we lost Stanislav Tomáš to a police officer who knelt on his neck until he died. Even here this year, Dylan Lee, a 19-year-old Gypsy boy from Durham, actually killed himself because his family received numerous hate crimes on their site, and they actually killed their animals on the site. And the police, all they did was have a community meeting to bring all the community to go and talk to the family about why they don't want them there on their own land. Dylan killed himself 5 days before. And I don't think people realise the level of pain that our community is going through all the time. When I moved to Budapest for 8 months to help out with the Romani organisation there, I had to move into the Romani ghetto in District 8 because no one will live with Gypsy people. Nobody. And it was also the time where there was anti-Romani riots in the city where our Holocaust memorials were destroyed with chants of killing gypsies equals ending crime, with our women dragged through the streets by their hair. This happens every damn day. And I don't think people realise. I want you all to consider, as I talk here, your past opinions of my community, your family's opinions, your local area, your politicians. What is something that you learned about my community before you ever got a chance to see the fabulous self in this lilac tracksuit? You know? And I think, like... And I think what we have to learn if we want to be radical and revolutionary is you have to actively stand by our communities. We don't have to be nice. I can be nasty and valid, do you know what I'm saying? I can be a crank if I want. And I think, like, this is the thing, is that we need to get back to actually actively doing stuff. Because when me and a Romani mate of mine down Manchester went down to a site, it was me and them stood in between an armed tactical aid unit vehicle with weapons and a site, on me own, on me billy bob. And, like, you know, it can be seen as kind of hilarious, because I was stood there with me like 26-inch extensions in, flailing about. But like the thing is that I could have died. And like the thing is I don't think people are actually willing to actually care about communities. It's all right sitting in here talking about, you know, people of colour, gypsy Roma travellers and all that. But it's in your everyday lives, actively challenging people that might not like you after you say, well, actually, gypsy and travel people are quite mint, and you're actually all trying to copy us in all these kind of different ways, you know. And I think this is the thing, is that you don't understand how bad it is for us. A few weeks ago, I had to file a hate crime because I had a woman from like Ellesmere Port rockering off at me saying that I'm a Gyppo skank. And like, that might be true, but like, do you know what I mean? Like, I am, thank you very much. I have a receipt at the end of it, but like, you know, but like at the end of the day, like, she was threatening to like kill communities in the area on sites. And like, this is my everyday. Like, I don't just do activism. I'm out there on the streets talking to people on council estate, going down on roadside encampments on my own. And even in my job, I'm on universal credit, my friend. I don't get a lot of money, me, yeah. I afford my little, you know, YSL acrylics, like, but I ain't got much else. And like, the thing is that I feel like we're doing all this work that puts us in danger all the time. And I'm constantly having to explain to people how we're humans and how bad it has been. It wasn't too long ago that a quarter of our population as gypsy people were systematically murdered in the Holocaust. We never got any reparations for that. We have revolutionary people that none of you know the names of. And I think it's the same as what Gracie was saying before, being the fabulous person they are. Like, there's been communities that have known about Bill and police violence before Kill the Bill was even uttered. Lived experience. We can not only engage with politics the moment it impacts us slightly. It is more than just policy. It is about the eradication of a police state, of an incarcerate state. It is about a system that is working very well that needs to be deconstructed from the ground up in the old way that our granddaddies and grandmas used to. And the thing is that we've forgotten that as a movement. I don't see us going round talking to working class communities anymore. It's all discussions in these very small exclusive spaces about, I don't know, Trotsky or whoever. And it's like at the state, I don't know anything about it. Don't know now, but I know that when my granddaddies were trade unionists, they sat around a table with a piece of bread and said, listen here, yeah, this ain't happening. And that's something that I can understand, and so can everyone else. The reason that we don't have cohesive change happening is because we're not actually engaging with communities in our local areas. We've forgotten localities. Because the thing is, yeah, like I'm from down in a random village on the edge of North Wales and West Midlands. Nothing happening. It can't all be city-based. It can't all be down south, yeah. The North and Wales, massively underfunded, now going on. And I can tell you for sure that in my village, there has been racism, scary stuff going on that nobody cares about because it's not easy to get to via train or bus. It's hard. But the thing is that that's where it's all happening in local areas that nobody really gives much about. That's what's happening. And like, we need to be able to connect more. Gypsy and traveller people, we are the revolutionary people of this country and wider Europe. We are the people that have survived mass extermination for 1,000 years and still manage to pass down terminology that we are against the state and always have been. We do not need to be radicalised. We were born radicalised. And no longer will our blood run down the streets of UK and wider Europe. This is a scary thing. And no matter how much you guys care, it cannot just be a check-in, check-out, oh, the legislation's changed, off I pop. No. You got to stay. You got to stay out. Because my job as a peer mentor, yeah, working with substance misuse and mental health, I see the impact of austerity every, am I allowed to swear? Fucking day.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. My daily life is having people showing up 25 years on crack or heroin, have been given absolutely now, being absolutely, you know, lamb-shanked by the councils every day. That is my daily life. It is travellers coming up to me from my community, especially they're actually trans Irish traveller girls that come to my work, begging for me to help them. And I do what I can, yeah. I put my heart and soul into that. But I think a lot of people who engage in political action, especially leftism, need to understand that they need to be understanding what it's like for frontline people who are actively on the streets, in the shit, with the gathers, who are pulling me hair back. Thankfully, when I was in Manchester and the police were shoving me backwards and yanking me hair, it was extensions, so I could have unclipped myself if needed, like. But, like, the thing is that, like, this is the reality, yeah? You can be radical and not know naught about whatever radical book someone else that's like 1,000 pages long. You're born radical. You're born it. I think this is the thing. So many people think they can't be political. They don't realise that the personal is political. Every inch of you as a person is political in your lived experience, in your life, in your heritage, in your ancestry. And I know for a fact, that I'm speaking with my grandmother's eyes, my great-grandma's thing. I've got about, 16th century anger going on in my body right now. And I think it's okay to occupy space. You don't have to be aesthetic or have optics. You can be a fantastic worker by going in your local community and sorting stuff out. Because the thing is that every day of my life, I have people turning up that are on the brink of either relapse, death, or on the streets. And that's just my job. Then I go home and I'm going around all the roadside sites in the area, being an absolute nuisance to every copper going. And and I think you have to be able to be uncomfortable. Because everyone speaking today has been through it. It's time that people realise that we are the people that enact our own change. I don't need someone with, a Cambridge degree telling me how to truly do a revolution. We need things going on now that enact that. We want changes now. And the only thing that comes from is organising on the ground up, getting round people, having a bit of a gather, having a bit of a chat, going, it's a bit bad, isn't it? Why don't we unionise? Everyone goes, all right. It's about making politics fun, speaking to people in their own language. Because I came up here and was like, ooh, yes, this is the tangible political state of affairs. It's like, I don't know what you're talking about. You just want a sarnie on the way home. And I think, that's what it's about. Radical community empowerment coming from council estates, universal credit, DOSA fabulousness. It comes from tackiness. It comes from bold, narky people. And that's fine. If you're a bit of a narc, go for it, my babs. And I think that's, I think I do talk quite a bit, don't I? Sorry, I ain't been let out for a while, you see. I had to don all my little Versace. But I think, on a real note, especially when you're looking at Traveller Pride, it's all free by people that aren't, we've all got lives, sort of. And I think this is the thing, is that my day-to-day, and our day-to-day is hearing people being disowned. And I go try and get through all the NGO sector, and it's like going around all these different things, and now it gets done. They've got nothing for people that need somewhere right now, so they need something now, because 5 working days is being on the streets. They don't understand the people that don't have bank cards, people don't have ID, people don't have documents and all that malark. We've got to try and make things, and that only comes from us being in the positions of making those decisions and actively doing it. I don't get paid, but I'm still out doing my malark every day, out there trying to graft and create something important, talking to people, trying to sort out somewhere they can go, something that we can build that's actually tangible and not just a load of fluff on casework that gets pushed around for councils and anyone to approve. It's about understanding that it's not just about decolonising and getting the gathers out, it's about getting rid of that gather in your head. Because I know every space, everywhere, there is policing going on within everyone going. There is all sorts of policing and surveillance antics going on in people's minds because you've been raised within that, you've been built up within that. It's about acknowledging things like whiteness, it's about acknowledging things like privilege. I'm still very privileged, me, myself, Like most travelling people can't sit up here and come and talk and rock around to all of yous. It's the people on sites living the life. I'm still a very privileged person. It's about getting that adversity coming up. This is just the beginning, it's not the end. All right, well, I'll pass on now,
Amazing. Thanks for that, Lois. Obviously, a lot of work for us to do after this. I think the most important thing for me is to pick a better panel outfit, because you've definitely put us all to shame. So, please, thank you. I'm on a session tomorrow, so. But absolutely incredible. Let's go on to our last speaker, Zehrah Hasan. Zehrah is a barrister at Garden Court Chambers, founding member of Black Protest Legal Support, and coordinator for the trade union Legal Sectors Workers United. Zehrah, obviously in your position, particularly as in Black Protest Legal Support, you've seen firsthand how the police react at protests, particularly with regards to black communities and GRT communities, and also how they police borders. So as well as speaking to that, it also, to be slightly provocative, what do you think is genuinely achievable, though, via the legal route, via the legal profession and the judiciary?
Cool, thanks, Nav. That is going to be a really hard act to follow. I should probably just echo everything you said and not do my speech, but I'll tell you what I prepared anyway. Thanks so much for having me here today. I wanted to give a content warning as well, because I'm going to talk in detail about police violence and racial state violence as well. But my fellow panelists have covered a lot of ground, so there's kind of two main things I wanted to focus on today with regards to this bill. The first is kind of looking at the racist effect of the policing bill and of the existing policing state on black, brown, racialized and migrant protesters and trade unionists, including some of the insights that I've got from the ground as someone who's involved in Black Protest Legal Support. And then secondly, just looking at some of the strategies of resistance that we can collectively adopt going forwards. So on the racist effect, as Nav mentioned earlier, the government have said that the racist consequences of this bill are objectively justified. And lots of people have been shocked at this response, but as Lois said, it's not surprising to the communities who are impacted by it. We know that this bill was intentionally created to further oppress black, brown, racialized and migrant communities. Any form of expanding police hours will always inevitably disproportionately impact these groups, given that we know that the police are institutionally racist and systematically target people of colour. And so on protest rights, this is just another heavy tool in the state's racist and classist armoury. And so that's why when we talk about the chilling effect of this bill, we have to also talk about its racist effect. And the levels of police brutality at protests, particularly those predominantly attended by or led by black, brown or racialized protesters, will persist and definitely worsen. And the legal repercussions for those groups will also be detrimental. In terms of police violence, we know the police have always treated black, brown and racialized protesters with particular contempt and violence. We saw this at the Mangrove protests in the 1970s. We saw this at the Black People's Day of Action in 1981. We know that the police are institutionally racist, and so by extension, their policing of protests is the same. And so to provide a perspective from the ground, Black Protest Legal Support has had legal observers at the majority of the large protests in London with big numbers of black, brown, racialized and migrant protesters. And we saw the police routinely deploy riot gear, exert physical and verbal intimidation, and charge horses at people at BLM protests last summer. We saw the police brutalize and leverage Islamophobic comments against Free Palestine activists in May this year, including seeing racialized children being hit with batons and other protesters sustaining severe injuries as a result of being beaten by the police, with at least one requiring hospital treatment. Multiple black, brown and racialized people have been violated, assaulted and arrested, with many targeted at Kill the Bill protests in London, and that's despite those protests being overwhelmingly white. And this also included the arrest of 5 of our legal observers in March, April this year, including myself and some of my comrades in the audience, the majority of us being from racialized backgrounds. And so I want to echo, when I say this, what Lois also said about black, brown and racialized people putting their bodies on the line time and time again, and despite being the ones who are most at risk of police violence. And so what Black Protest Legal Support has seen at these protests is just a continuation of a long pattern of racist policing, where officers behave with heightened violence and aggression towards racialized demonstrators. And this is obviously reflected in broader forms of state racism, because the media remains silent on the very real state violence that we saw at these protests, and instead played into racist tropes of describing black and or Muslim protesters as aggressive and threatening. The perception of black and brown protesters as threats is what has sparked this bill in the first place, with the report that sort of was the springboard of this bill referencing the BLM movement as a reason for needing further police powers. And so in a system where we know that police are 5 times more likely to use force against black people, and nearly 1 in 3 incidents involving the use of force against black, brown, and racialized people, giving the police more power will only worsen this violence against our communities. We've also seen state violence and discrimination meted out towards migrant communities. So when protests and multiple protests have been held at Napier Barracks, the horrific site where many asylum seekers are being held, residents are routinely told that if they participate, security guards will send their names to the Home Office, and their participation in any form of demonstration will affect their asylum claims. And in January this year, the police were called to a protest staged by asylum seekers, organised by asylum seekers outside Napier. And so when 100 people walked out and some were sleeping outside in resistance to the conditions at Napier, there was an immense policing response. And so with this bill handing out greater powers to quell these types of actions or criminalising people who take part or organise them, people with precarious immigration status are at heightened risk, particularly in a system where racist deportations exist. And so in this way, we can also see how suppressing the right to protest also functions to uphold and maintain the UK's racist border regime. And with this bill containing very vague and broad provisions that are very easy to interpretation, we know that what will come with that is more police brutality and state control. So essentially, having terms like serious annoyance, disruption, impact, or intimidation, coupled with much weightier penalties that will impact those already more heavily criminalised by the state, will mean that essentially black, brown, and racialised people will be arrested more, they'll be charged more, and they'll be sentenced harsher. We already know this from the stats on sentencing. Black, brown, and racialised people represent 27% of those in prison, despite making up 14% of the population. And in the youth punishment system, nearly half of children incarcerated are from black, brown, and racialised communities. And so the bill, with its penalisation of protesters, as well as the provisions to criminalise GRT communities and the serious violence reduction orders Gracie mentioned, will obviously deepen existing racial oppression. I also think it's important to note that the impact of this bill on protests will be mirrored in terms of how it's leveraged to suppress strike action. Workers throughout history have used the power of protest to call out exploitation and oppression by bosses, and protest goes to the heart of the trade union movement, with the right to organise effectively and take collective action falling under our right to protest. As I mentioned, I'm a member of United Voices of the World, which is a trade union led by and predominantly made up of precarious and migrant workers. And 88% of our members believed that making noise on picket lines were essential to the success of previous campaigns. And so the bill's ability to impose restrictions on static protests, where noise generated can result in intimidation or harassment or cause serious unease, alarm, or distress, and the Home Secretary being empowered to decide what constitutes serious disruption and restrict protests accordingly, will have obviously direct implications on picket lines. And so in this way, this bill is also furthering the interests of capital and explicitly enables the police and the state to suppress class struggle. So essentially, what this bill does is it puts police impunity on the ground that we know has been taking place for years against our communities on a legislative footing. So turning to strategies of resistance, what can we actually do? Well, in my view, I don't think this battle can be won in Parliament. And as Gracie said, anything being done is going to be damage control. With such a significant Tory majority, and with Keir Starmer being a proponent of enforcing a criminal justice response to structural issues like gender-based violence, and supporting putting more police officers on the streets, we can't, in my view, rely on party politics to keep our communities safe. there's a cognitive disconnect between supporting pro-carceral solutions to anything on one hand and then opposing this bill because of its racist impact. And so to address Naveed's point, yes, there might be really narrow ways we can use the law to challenge certain provisions of this bill once it becomes into force. So strategic litigation through public law challenges or criminal appeals could lay bare the ways this bill thwarts the right to protest as protected under the Human Rights Act. But again, I do think that the law is limited and it's a piecemeal response because it will only go so far in containing police power, and it doesn't prevent the trauma of people being assaulted, brutalized, and arrested before these cases even come to fruition. The battle against this authoritarian power move will be fought and won on the streets. And it's about making this bill fundamentally unenforceable and in showing up for marginalized and racialized communities who are putting their bodies on the line day in, day out. We also have to ensure that our movements are connected and that our collective power is leveraged against the state. And I just wanted to give a couple of examples of this that we've seen over the last year. Recently, the Fire Brigades Union refused to move Palestine Action activists engaging in direct action at an Israeli arms factory when they were called to assist a policing operation. Yeah, it was really, really good. The union released a statement emphasizing that their role doesn't involve law enforcement. They stood in support of Palestinian solidarity, and they also believed in the right to protest. We also saw an effort in Glasgow with an immense effort by the local and community activists preventing an immigration raid, forcing the police to release 2 men detained in an enforcement van. And I think both these examples show what we're capable of when, firstly, we show material solidarity with each other, and secondly, when we quite literally outnumber state agents on the ground. I think we also have to embed these actions and movements in an abolitionist framework. We can't change a racist society without abolishing the key tools of racist oppression, from the police to prisons to borders. And that's why we have to support organising efforts by groups like Black Lives Matter and Sisters Uncut, and be openly critical of groups which undermine this border struggle by supporting police reform and the myth of policing by consent, and unfortunately groups like Reclaim These Streets that have done that. Our approach to killing this bill has to always be grounded and informed by the experiences of those at the sharpest end of state violence. And that's why the work that Black Protest Legal Support does and the work that people like Lois does is so important, because we're essentially on the ground all the time, monitoring police brutality against racialized people, documenting racial state violence, and supporting people directly affected. And that way we can expose and evidence why abolition is the only answer. So as this session has been framed, attacked together, resisting together, I think we have to remember that in a system built on our oppression, our shared power can't be underestimated. And I think the law's not the answer, Parliament's not the answer, but our collective action is not limited. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Zehrah. Really useful messages, and another reason that we all know that firefighters are the hottest emergency service. So sorry to the paramedics out there. We are going to move to Q&A now. Before we do that, raise your hands if you have got questions, and hopefully somebody with a roving mic will be able to come to you. Just very quickly though, before we get to Q&A, do any of the panelists want to respond to what each of you have said? You don't have to, we can go straight to the Q&A. Ready to go, let's do this. So has anybody got a mic that can help? If we can go to the gentleman there.
Hey, so I think one of the communities that often gets overlooked when it comes to state violence and carceral violence is autistic people. So Gracie mentioned police in schools. A few weeks back, I can't remember exactly when, there was CCTV footage released of a young boy in a school in Liverpool being kicked and punched by a police officer. who was there for some reason. And I hope that like some people here will remember the case of Asim Brown, who was going to be deported to Jamaica, which he hadn't been to since he was like 4 years old, and he had like no support network. That fortunately fell through, and there is now a petition on change.org to clear his name. But like signs of distress and anxiety that we exhibit are seen as like signifiers of suspicion and threats within the cops. So I was wondering if the panel had any thoughts as to how we might incorporate the kind of growing autistic rights movement into any efforts to fight state violence, and not as like an act of charity, but as like active participants and comrades.
Thank you. We're going to take 2 or 3 questions at a time, so can we come to the person here, please?
Hiya, I'm Billy, and I left my role at neurodivergent Labour because I'm also autistic to join the Northern Independence Party. But anyways, my question is, he basically stole like half my question, but as we all know, the police have been violent and hostile, not just towards autistics, but also towards black people, trans people, other neurodivergent people, women and other minorities. And I was just wondering, how are we as people going to get it into these busy heads that how are we going to get it into the police's minds that we need to incorporate the voices of neurodivergent people, and that we need to clear Asim Brown's name, because for those who didn't know, he was accused of stealing a mobile phone, and when he went to court, his mates were the ones who robbed the phone, and the witness came up to the dock and said he didn't do it, he told him to stop. So how are we going to make sure that the busies are not going to interfere with neurodivergent people and other minorities?
Thank you, thank you. I think we can take one more question. I think, yeah.
Thank you. It's quite a short one, but how can protesters with privilege protect the rights and ensure the safety of minority protesters who may experience a disproportionate level of police violence? Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've got a question on making autistic people an active part of the movement and the resistance, how to stop police from reacting violently to neurodivergent people, and also how those with privilege can protect those without in protests and other scenarios in contact with the police. So does anybody want to, so you've got the mic? No, that's...
I'm going to speak to number 2, so...
Whoever's got the mic in their hand has to start speaking.
Yeah. Is it just responding to like...
Anything, everything
right,
and
well,
anything.
all right.
Yeah.
I was getting like overloaded then. I was like, what's going on? Yeah. I think something that's really important is that we need to include neurodiversity within every part of the movement, and that comes with actually properly networking with those communities, like properly, because that hasn't happened. And I probably due to things like ableism and all sorts of things that within our movements don't really want to be addressed. Because I think this comes into a lot of like even accessibility to events. Like even today, I can imagine it's quite triggering for some to have the loud samba band whilst having to try and listen to this and listen to everybody else. There needs to be active things, and the only way that we can do that is having people like yourself, like you, or whoever is neurodivergent, like being an active part of those decision makings. It's about having those positions of power and having those positions of voices, and you haven't been given that, and it sucks. And I think that's part of like creating change. And I think also, especially when you look at like police violence, there's actually a really prominent neurodiverse Romani activist called Nikki Hughes, who does a lot on talking about how they struggle with their children who are also neurodivergent with autism, and the difficulty they face with police, because often, especially in the Gypsy Roma traveller community, we're so often demonised, especially when a lot of us have ADHD, like myself. We are villainised as being like demonic people. And it's like, that is not true. It's because people do not understand neurodiversity. It's not been an active part of our movements. And including that as part of it is part of decolonising as well, and part of all the greater movement things too. In terms of like violence, I feel like the only way that we can get police responses to be different is that we need to continue with getting rid of police. We're never going to teach the police to be more like they. Sorry? Exactly, yeah. You know, oh, you got it in your head, yeah, do you know what I mean? But it's like, I think this is like, the thing is that we need to get rid of this system which is always going to undermine and exploit marginalised people, especially those who are neurodiverse, who they think that they can easily, you know, pie off with policy and difficult situations which are very hard to understand anyway. Navigating the police when you're neurotypical can be difficult enough because of all the different things you have to say. It feels like you have to have magic words all written down on a piece at the back of a beer mat. And it's like, you know, and I feel like that's part of what we need to do. And it comes from being the bodies in front of neurodiverse people and communities and actually properly engaging, especially in local schools and things like that. All sorts going on in every single school. My school, yeah, had a special needs block that was rampant with problematic, toxic and abusive behaviour to those who had those difficult needs. And this is going on in schools up and down the country. And this is what it comes to. It can't all just be on a national level, yeah, with like NGO sector, what have you. You have to be actively engaging and keeping on top of things like schools, liaising with parents and those students in schools who are neurodiverse and dealing with stuff, because they know their lived experience. We often think that neurodiverse people can't represent themselves. They already are, and they're doing it all the time. And it's also a lot of resistance that's coming from neurodiverse communities in school settings because they know that things aren't right, but because it's not coming across in a way that is palatable, they can easily be fobbed off, demonised, kicked out of school, put through all sorts in the system. And when you add intersectionality to that, of like blackness, being a person of colour, being a gypsy Roma traveller or anything like that, the layers continue. So yeah, I mean, I'd be like, get rid of the gathers, like, but I mean, like, with what you were saying about like privilege, yeah, there's a lot of things at protests that like don't happen. They all want people of colour, gypsy Roma travellers, all that malark to be at protests. And then you get there, there's no safety things put in place. They have a buddy system where any stranger can sign up to just be your buddy, which doesn't work because the moment that the gathers hit and the coppers start coming, people just run off and you're just left. It also comes from, I cannot stress this enough, white privileged people. When I say white, I'm going to say white gorgeous because I mean I still identify as white like, but like aggravating the police when not needed for their own kind of like charisma politics. Like, you know, a situation will already be difficult for people of colour and further marginalised groups. And then you have someone called like Tarquin, who like has a degree in, I don't know, like revolutionary politics, who like starts up going, there, starts shouting, screaming, throwing beer cans at the police, aggravating situations which they don't suffer the consequences of. Because when the gathers start getting out and they start charging at people, yeah, start arresting people, taking them off to God knows where, yeah, it's not them getting arrested because they jog on. It'll when they happen there, bit embarrassing, let's forget that, do you know what I mean? But like, you know, it's those people, especially disabled people who can't get away as fast, you know, potentially, who get arrested and end up having to go through the system and get a criminal record. And that needs to change as well. I have no time anymore for these people that take up space at protests just for their own bravado. And, you know, they get very excited about being arrested. It's all very exciting and you know, nothing's exciting about it for people who are terrified of that stuff. You know, it isn't an addition to your ego to be arrested and put into a police like prison. And, you know, and like that needs to change starters. And I think helping comes from actually listening to the communities. Like no one ever asks, like, what do you want? It's all just, well, we'll do this and that, and it'll be dead cushy, yeah? And it's like, well, actually, that isn't going to work, and it makes everyone feel isolated and alienated. So, yeah, I think that needs to stop, all those different things. And not being active bystanders. Like, I've been at a Kill the Bill protest where I had a girl running over to me going, buy a fucking house. I was like, all right, landlord mentality. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, oh, buy a house. Oh, yeah, okay. Does 40p do it, like? But, but it's like there's stuff that happens. There was a whole load of people stood there with Kill the Bill signs. No one said no, apart from one person who was like a woman of colour who like stepped in, who was then getting abuse from that situation. It's like there's all these people that will say all the right things, and then when it comes to an actual do or don't situation, they always choose don't. Always don't do anything, And the thing is that they don't understand the nuances of those situations. When I start yelling at people, when a woman goes, buy a fucking house, and I'm yelling at going, all right, dawdy then, you're going to ask me to buy a house, jog on, you cretin. It then comes back on me because I'm the aggressive gypsy person with a big sign that says, my big fat gypsy revolution, narking at someone. And that's what gets taken photos of by the media. They love that. They love angry gypsies. Yeah. I think that's, sorry, I'm going on again. Yeah, I get on a bit of a...
I'm just worried
sorry, guys, yeah.
I'm worried for the other panellists have to follow you again.
Yeah,
this is like...
Right, who's next then? Do you want to...
Go, Gracie. Yeah.
Do you want
I think just to kind of follow up from what Lois has said about the privilege point, I think this is like a tension that Black Protest Legal Support has really had to deal with, because the reason we set up is because we felt that the legal observer community was very white, and that meant that people couldn't really connect with the communities that were protesting and also weren't actually legal observing a lot of the protests that were led by and predominantly attended by Black, brown and racialized people. And so a lot of our legal observers are also from Black, brown and racialized communities, but what that means is that they're also more at risk of police violence when they're on the ground as well. And so one of the things that's really obvious to us is that when we go to protests and, we have a lot of white legal observers as well, it's always the Black, brown and racialized legal observers who put their body in between protests and police officers when the violence is kicking off. It's always the Black, brown and racialized legal observers who are on the front line trying to take notes of what's going on. And it's always them that are then dealing with, people at protests who are traumatized and who need support. And that obviously has an impact as well on the people that, we're sending out on the ground. And it's so common to see the white legal observers from our groups and other groups kind of standing on the sidelines, like you said, kind of being, passive bystanders. And I think it's really important that if you are going to be, if you're going to attend a protest in solidarity as a white person, if you're going to do things like legal observing as a white person, it's important as well to be on the front lines and to recognize the privilege that you have in, being literally in that space compared to a Black, brown or racialized person. And so I think that's a really important thing because, ultimately, when the arrests happen, what happened was essentially we were taking notes of the fact that Black, brown and racialized protesters had been literally targeted by the police at a predominantly white protest. They'd been taken off the side, surrounded by 20 police officers each, and were being, arrested. And it was, three racialized legal observers who went to take notes of that. And as soon as we did that, then the police wanted to stop us from monitoring what they were doing. And in order to do that, they arrested us as well. And so, obviously in that situation, we're being very clear about we stand with our communities. We're not saying we're not going to continue doing that. Of course, people like me and my Black and brown comrades are going to keep doing that. But we also do need white people to do that because otherwise we're fighting this on our own. So, yeah.
Belle?
Just to add to that point, I think it's a really important one to go on, especially in a room like this, especially when we're talking to people from the left, especially when we're talking to white people from the left, because I think a lot of the time there's this idea that if you're on the left and you call yourself an anti-racist, you're just an anti-racist. There's nothing for you to question. But we live in a completely racist society. So if at any point you think to yourself, you're all good, and you are that top anti-racist and nothing's ever going to change that, then that's the point at which you need to question yourself. Because I think a lot of the time on the left, people forget. People forget that they don't. Yeah. And I don't mean it in a mean way, because, you know, at the end of the day, the left has supported black, brown, racialized communities for years. But yeah, far too often that point is forgotten. If you're not actively anti-racist, you're just another part of the problem. And in terms of policing, I think people need to be, and this is what some of my colleagues in Parliament don't understand, people need to grasp why people want to defund the police, because it's become increasingly, our criminal justice system has become less about rehabilitation and less about keeping other people safe and more about criminalising particular communities. The problem with that is, you know, rich people don't go to jail. I think about a young black man in my constituency caught with drugs, will be, you know, harassed. He may even end up going to jail, and depending on, not even necessarily, he might have even been born in this country, could still face deportation on the basis that he's found with drugs. Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, actually all of them that stood in that leadership contest, all admitted to taking drugs, all probably have had quite a lot. Nothing happens to them, and that's the reality throughout society. And I think we need to look more at some of the things that prevent some of the crimes that people go on to do, or actually rehabilitate people. I'm really, really concerned about that more generally. And I think my colleagues in Parliament need to understand why people want to defund the police more, because it's because of the type of, you know, organisation it's now become. And actually, with the policing powers, I was really shocked to find some senior police officers saying that they don't want these extra powers that are given to them in the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, because they said, if you give us these extra powers, we will use them. And they know that, and for them to acknowledge that them using those powers is a scary thing within itself, should show us what we're heading for. And people think it's a bit pie in the sky, but I still believe we can defeat it. We slowed it down, and, you know, as you've heard, and I'm saying this as an MP, it is going to be one out in the streets. There's only so much we can do for a parliamentary side, and we will continue to do that. There are many of us in Parliament. There are a small amount of us in Parliament that are willing to do that. But we need your support. So yes, just keep continuing to show up. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't have a huge amount to add. I suppose what I was thinking about in respect of the first question was just that actually contemporary struggles to diminish police powers and for abolition actually have already learned a lot from the work and activism of people who have been struggling against carceral systems in mental health. You know, yes, there's a need for the work to be different now, but we also need to look at whose shoulders we're standing on. I think Abolitionist Futures have produced some really great resources tracing that history in terms of the struggle against incarceration for people perceived to have mental health problems. And I suppose the other thing I would do is just echo in response to the second question that, and I say this as someone who, I work in the policy space, I work with politicians all the time, and I have these ridiculous conversations about why we're not going to train the police out of everything. You know, I had this completely surreal conversation earlier in the year about why unconscious bias training for judges. Like, it's just not, like, why? Why is that the conversation that people are trying to get me to have? That's not the way that we need to be going. So I think it's just really important that we recognise that often we get sucked into these conversations about policing when we need to be talking about something else entirely, and we've already halfway lost when we're only within that frame of policing. I think the Inquest and the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies have done some really interesting work around mental health first responders. You know, we should be asking so much of the time, why were the police there in the first instance? I am just continuing to talk about why we love firefighters. You know, I lived in France for a long time. France has got real problems with policing, but I found it really interesting. You know, I was in a bar one night, somebody fell down and hit his head. Everybody was like, call the fire brigade, right? You know, there are you can have first responders that don't have these coercive powers who can come and actually care for people. But I think it's also really important for us to recognise actually why police are getting called in the first instance and the ableism that underpins that. Some of you will know the case of ZH, who was a young person who was autistic at a swimming pool, staring at the water, not going to jump in. Manager of the centre really frightened that he was going to jump in, even though his mum was saying he's not going to jump in. All of these police officers then turn up because they've been called, this person is restrained and so on. And, it's ableism that underpins that impulse to kind of, detain, make more normal, corral in some way. So I think we can't just say decenter the police in first responding. We also need to deal with ableism across society and what we perceive as behaviour that needs to be policed.
Just to say as well, I'm kind of noted that obviously a lot of resources have been mentioned throughout. I think I'm right to say this session is being recorded, so do obviously check it out on YouTube and share it with everybody and hopefully pick up on some of the resources that hopefully we'll be able to put on the TWT website as well. We should have time for one more round of questions. I think there's yet a couple there. If we can get Mike to 2 people there and then one at the front as well.
Hi, this is sort of Lois, I think, is it? Yeah, but it can be for everyone. When you said that point about sort of like the very academic sort of intellectual terms, I was sort of thinking about that and sort of the fact that we have a lot of terms for very complex sort of, political, economic processes. And I find actually it in a way, it's just ridiculous. You have to add on words onto words onto words in order to describe very complex things. And like you've said, is these communities that have been oppressed already have these terms. So with that in mind, and also keeping in mind of things like appropriation and everything, is there sort of space for terms from those communities to make their way into sort of how we talk about these things? Because then we don't have to keep, adding in a bunch of adjectives. We have terms that actually describe all the sort of, if we're talking about capitalism, the fact that it's racist and the fact that it is sort of rooted in all of these different oppressions. And rather than trying to, spend all of our time describing what it is, actually just have words and terms to say that? Or is it more coming up with new ones in conversation with these communities?
There's a lady at the back. Lady at the back there.
Hello, thank you. This has been amazing. I've just got a question around sort of white privilege and stuff like that. White privilege. Things like direct action, so mentioning Palestine Action. There is an idea that actually people, such as me, using my privilege to do things like direct action, because actually, the treatment that I will get by the police is not the same as black, brown, racialised people will receive. So I just wonder what your view is. We're talking about people going to protests and sort of making things worse. What you think of sort of that side of things, of getting involved in direct action and using our privilege to do that.
Thank you. And I think one last question here. Yeah. Could you put your hand up, please? Yeah.
Hi. So this might be less of a question, to be honest, but I'm actually raging. So I'm just going to take up a little bit of space. So if anyone sat in this room and is hearing about all of the violence that we're living and isn't sat there raging, all I would say is that if you're asking these questions, get out there, just get the fuck out there and do something. This is our every single day. Every single day is a raging experience. Why are we being so harmed? Why are our lives being told that they are worth less? And, to the person who asked about neurodivergence, obviously we've just gone through a pandemic. We have literally seen people put "do not resuscitate" on the fucking like boards in hospital of people who have learning disabilities. So why isn't this rage literally within every single one of us? Where literally our communities are being told, you aren't worth living. And I literally don't know what to say. How come they aren't riots? Because at this point, you can probably see I'm shaking. What will it take? What will it take? They've literally stood up now and said, actually, racism, objectively, is necessary. So now what do you want me to fucking do? Because we're being backed into a fucking corner at this point. And if you're not putting your body on the line, then you need to ask yourself what you're doing. Why are you sat here listening to this? Is it to make yourself feel better?
Thank you for that. We had a couple of questions there. We've got about 10 minutes, so please do keep the responses relatively brief. There was a question on academic terms and terms that we already have and how we kind of make them just part of the kind of lexicon that we have already. And also a question on white privilege and direct action. Does anybody want to start on that? Gracie, you've got the mic.
I do have the mic. So, I mean, it's tricky. I have complicated thoughts about white privilege, and because I do, like, obviously people need to understand where they're positioned within certain power structures and, like, act accordingly. I do have, I'm just going to end up saying something really philosophical because I haven't thought this through to the end. Like, I do have a bit of difficulty with how much emphasis there is on white privilege and privilege discourse in general, because whiteness stays at the center of that. And I think, then, like, I spend a lot of time getting asked for advice on stuff by white people I can't be bothered to answer. I think, I do think that some of the privilege discourse really holds us back from understanding that it's collective liberation or bust. But it's complicated because, I also spend a lot of time in spaces where people literally have no idea where they're positioned, completely unaware, the space is really hostile, and so on and so forth. And I also don't think that, I keep forgetting who it is, but, whoever, it's black feminist organisers who talk about the fact that the coalition isn't your home, but coalitional politics is how we get out of here. And so I think, I don't think that we can retreat into sameness. But I also, I worry about the amount of time and energy that goes into kind of hand-wringing about privilege and the work that doesn't get done when we spend the time with that. So that's where I am there.
I should have said as well is that if you've got any closing words, as well as this is the last few minutes, Gracie, did you have any closing words, or happy to drop the mic on that? Literally drop the mic. Yeah.
Just to say, I completely agree with Gracie on what she's saying about white privilege in terms of the discourse and how it's taking up space. But I will say that I do actively support using white privilege as a means, particularly in forms of process or any type of actions that helps protect minoritized communities. I know as an MP, that particularly in the Socialist campaign group, when somebody tries to come at us, say we're going to get in trouble for signing this or doing that, I actively say John McDonnell did it first, or Jeremy Corbyn. That's them using their white privilege in that way, and also just to say, and this thought crosses my mind every once in a while when we use the word minority, that straight white cisgendered rich men are the minority of society. When we talk about coming together and we talk about all of our different groups and all of the different struggles we faced in various different ways throughout liberation movements, it's really important that we all recognise that, and recognise that in our numbers, if we stand together, we can change things.
I think I just echo what's been said. I think from my perspective, and I kind of want to hear what's been said about like rage as well. Like our communities do this stuff because we are like enraged every day about like how our lived experience is, and also how it's received by wider society. This constant kind of like, it playing into the same tropes that we're trying to resist, of like us being aggressive and us being threatening. And I think ultimately, like, we don't think about it, we just kind of do it, and we're not asking, you know, anyone apart from those within our own communities and those who we need to kind of, you know, make sure are also taking up space, how to do it. We just kind of go out there and do it. And I think it's really important that, yeah, like Gracie said, like, you know, the conversation about how whiteness can occupy the space isn't centered, because that kind of perpetuates the problem. And instead, like, actually just like looking at what Black, brown and racialized communities are doing, like following suit, talking to them, like making sure that there's like material solidarity, but also importantly, like not centering yourself in that space and just doing what's needed on a very like physical and emotional level a lot of the time. So yeah.
With the question about like intellectualism, I think what needs to be done to change these things, it's about who's leading the space. Because the thing is, when you have working class people leading spaces, the lingo comes with it. You can't kind of adapt to that environment as you have people leading the space. You come from that. And I think that's what happens when you have people from the council estates, from the homeless shelters, from all these different things coming together and leading those spaces, because we are already political. I think people think that working class people or underprivileged people haven't already been engaging in politics for a very long time, just that they're not comfortable enough to come to very, like, let's say, bourgeois spaces. And I think it's about when you have that and you create a space where it's leading that, the lingo changes. It's about connecting with communities and finding out what people know. Because if you don't talk to people, if you don't actually chat to folk, you don't know where people are going to be confused at. I think there's this thing, there's this dissonance now where people are no longer connecting with their local communities or the people around them about anything. We all just come to city-based spaces, discuss fabulous things and then leave. There's no actual discourse to know what actual people are struggling with, because we're uncomfortable with actually truly engaging with people with our political mindset. When actually, when you actually get out there and do it, like I've been doing, it's all cushy. And that's what then happens. And in terms of like this discussion of like what it's gonna take, I think it's important that I wanna leave this on is to say what it took for me to be, I guess, an activist. Like my grandmother, yeah, called Phyllis, she was like a proper brilliant woman. She used to always say the phrase, like, she was kind of a person who was like, I'd rather hit you than kiss you, which was like oddly fabulous. Strong woman, never, you know, was bothered about throwing a few punches or getting her hands dirty. She was absolutely amazing. And I had to watch this woman that I'd grown up with, lived with, loved, go into hospital and disintegrate before my very eyes. I had to watch that happen. I had to watch her go from a larger-than-life woman to a scared being, because a lot of the nurses would accuse her of theft, even though she couldn't physically walk. And it came out, actually, in the autopsy that after she died, there were several broken ribs that had led to internal bleeding, which led to a premature death that hadn't been recorded by nurses in the medical book. There was an inquest where my family, who have never had tuppence to understand legalities, trying to fringe together some kind of defence, and it was just seen as a just cause. They actually had to stand up out of respect, they were told to, for the medical staff walking in. My father, yeah, he still works at a hospital as a boiler man, and he calls all of the higher-ups suits, because he does not trust an ounce of these snidey people that are in every area of our lived experience. My grandmother was dead, killed. I will never get her back. She is gone. And for me, I had to watch the woman that raised me die. And my mother and my auntie fall apart like I've never seen it before. And that's just me. And I'm a very privileged person. So imagine what it's like and the other amount of stories that are just like mine that come out of others. That's what kicked me up the arse, was seeing someone that I adored in a coffin over it. And the worst part of it all is after she died, there was all this discourse about, you know, oh, you know, there's all these NGOs that can help you. Never heard of them. Never seen them, never bothered. And I think that this is the reality. Most of us, a lot of us from marginalised groups, especially racialised groups, we see that all the time. Death, pain, suffering, trauma, all the time. And I think to top this off as to what it takes, is a few months later I went to a human library where I was freely giving my time to educate people on my community. And I told my story about my grandmother to a woman who works in refugee action. I don't think she ever should, old white woman, gorger. And she goes, well, I'm glad your grandmother's dead because that's one less gypsy that will bother me with. And do you know what happened? No one did anything. I stood up and was shouting and screaming, and I was actually escorted out of the building for being a pain in the arse, apparently. That is what we experience when we come into your spaces. Shit. And if we think about what it takes, you really have to start thinking to yourself what it's like for us. And I'm still a very privileged person, you know. I still experience whiteness. I still experience all kinds of lavishes that a lot of people don't have. And that's what I had to experience, you know, losing someone. And that's not even the end of it, you know. All of that happens all the time. But yeah, that's what it takes.
Amazing. If we can have keep that round of applause going for all of our panelists, please, today.
Sorry, everyone, I have one quick favour to ask, and it's extremely random. I was meant to do something in the week. I was meant to get videos. It's Diane Abbott's birthday tomorrow, and she's not actually at a conference. So I've been tasked by her office to go around and get as many videos as possible. So I'm going to video all of you just saying, happy birthday, Diane. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday!
Amazing. What a lovely note to end on. I hope everybody's feeling enraged and empowered to take action on the various things. As I mentioned, this session has been recorded, so do pick it up on YouTube, particularly for the resources. I'm sure I need to say something exciting about the program, but I have no idea what's coming next, so just enjoy the festival.